A group of academics in their 30s got the keys to an entire country to use as their private laboratory. The experiment would cost thousands of bankruptcies and rewrite the rules of the global economy. Welcome to Plexo. September 12, 1973, Santiago, Chile. Smoke still rose over the city center. On the desks of the newly installed military junta sat a typed document about 189 pages long. They called it the brick. It wasn't a military manual, but a plan for radical restructuring. While the generals took political control by force, a committee of civilian economists took financial control. They were the Chicago Boys, a group of young Chileans who had studied at the University of Chicago under Milton Friedman. They returned with an absolute faith in free markets and total contempt for state intervention. Augusto Pinochet knew nothing about economics. His priority was consolidating power. So he delegated the management of the country to these technocrats, giving them absolute power. In a democracy, their ideas would have faced debate, strikes, and parliamentary opposition. Under an authoritarian regime, there was no resistance. Strikes were banned and the press censored. The plan required dismantling the protective state. They had to eliminate tariffs, privatize, free prices, and drastically cut public spending. It was shock therapy designed in American classrooms to be applied to millions of people. The laboratory was open, and the scientists had carte blanche to begin the greatest capitalist transformation of the 20th century. What no one inside the junta calculated was that the true cost wouldn't appear on any balance sheet. At the head of this economic squad was Sergio de Castro. Appointed minister and a former university professor, he treated the national economy like a mathematical equation, with no room for feelings. His diagnosis was clear: the country suffered from hyperinflation of 300%, and the medicine had to be bitter. In April 1975, Finance Minister Jorge Cawas announced the so-called Economic Recovery Program, also known as the shock treatment. Overnight, the government eliminated price controls on thousands of basic goods. Bread, milk, and transportation multiplied in value within hours. At the same time, it cut public employment by 20% and opened borders to foreign imports. The transition was brutal. In the courtyards of the central bank, workers fed industrial furnaces with bundles of the old currency, burning tons of worthless paper to make way for the new Chilean peso. The fire consumed the savings of an entire generation. The immediate consequences were devastating. National industry, accustomed to state protection, couldn't compete with imported goods. Hundreds of factories closed their doors. Unemployment skyrocketed, leaving thousands of families in absolute misery. However, on the spreadsheets of the Ministry of Finance, the plan worked. Inflation began to ease, and fiscal accounts balanced. For Sergio de Castro, social suffering was simply an inevitable transition cost. The patient was bleeding, but the fever was dropping. The second phase of the experiment was underway, and no one with the power to stop it was willing to lift a finger. With inflation under control, the Chicago Boys launched the biggest garage sale in Latin American history. Through the state agency Corfo, the government privatized and returned 725 public companies. From telecoms to airlines, mining to power plants, everything had a fire sale price. The problem was who bought them. Without a developed capital market, they were awarded to a small group of businessmen close to the regime, at ridiculous prices. Men like Julio Ponce Lara, Pinochet's son-in-law, laid the foundations of incalculable fortunes, using cheap credit from the state itself to buy the nation's assets. It was a sweet deal, financed with foreign debt. By 1980, the country was living in artificial boom, known as sweet money. Attracted by high interest rates, international banks lent dollars, hand over fist. The image of this illusion was surreal. At the port of Valparaiso, cranes unloaded rows of color TVs and imported sports cars, while a few blocks away, unemployed workers lined up for food rations at soup kitchens. The economy was growing at 8% a year. Santiago's shop windows filled with foreign goods, which people bought on credit. The runaway consumption hit a deep structural flaw. The miracle was not built on industrial production or domestic savings, but on a mountain of borrowed dollars that had to be repaid sooner or later. The entire country was mortgaged. And the creditors were already sharpening their contracts. In January 1982, Milton Friedman published a column in Newsweek. He unreservedly praised Pinochet's policies, officially dubbing the experiment the miracle of Chile. It was an ill-timed declaration. Just months after publication, the U.S. Federal Reserve abruptly raised interest rates. The flow of cheap dollars dried up overnight, and the Chilean miracle collapsed in a flash. The 1982 crisis was the country's worst economic catastrophe since the Great Depression. GDP plunged 14.3% in a single year. Official unemployment hit 23.7%, and more than 800 companies went bankrupt. The streets filled with desperate protests, which the regime crushed with extreme brutality. That's when the biggest paradox of the neoliberal experiment occurred. Chile's private banks, suffocated by foreign debt, were about to fail. To prevent total collapse, the same Chicago boys who preached free markets and hated the state had to use public money to bail out the bankers. The ideological defeat was crushing. Officials closing branches and pasting signs reading intervened on the doors of major private banks. The state ended up assuming the huge foreign debt of the private sector. International critics watched the irony with amazement, dubbing the bailout the Chicago road to socialism. Profits had been private. Losses were everyone's. Exactly the opposite of what the manual promised. After the 1982 disaster, the regime had to soften its fanaticism. A new economic team implemented a more pragmatic approach, regulating banks and devaluing the currency to boost exports. Starting in 1985, the economy began growing again, kicking off what defenders of the model call the true miracle. A second wave of privatizations was launched, further consolidating wealth concentration. When Pinochet left power in 1990, he left the economy tied up tight. The 1980 Constitution, drafted under the dictatorship, made it nearly impossible to reverse the Chicago Boys' reforms. Subsequent democratic governments kept the economic structure virtually intact, managing to reduce extreme poverty but inheriting chronic inequality. This legacy is etched into the urban landscape. Glass skyscrapers began rising in Santiago's new financial district, ironically known as Sanhattan, casting shadows over peripheral neighborhoods with wooden and sheet metal homes. Two realities coexist in the same territory, separated by the chasm of the free market. Today, Chile boasts one of the highest per capita incomes in the region, but it also ranks among the most unequal nations in the OECD. That radical experiment of the 1970s transformed the country into an export powerhouse, but built a society where education, healthcare, and pensions operate under the relentless logic of profit. The miracle was not Chile's, but rather that of those who turned an entire country into a disposable variable in an equation that was never designed to add up for everyone.